You think survival makes you weak? Let me tell you something about the girl they threw away like trash. The one marked defective in a world where imperfection means erasure. She didn't beg for mercy. She didn't break. She learned to breathe in silence while they crushed her bones beneath their boots. And when the king, the most ruthless predator in the empire, finally noticed her standing in the shadows where the forgotten go to die, something shifted. Not compassion, recognition. Because sometimes the strongest thing in the room isn't the one making the most noise. Stick around until the end of this story. You'll see what real power looks like when it's been forged in humiliation. Like and drop your city in the comments. Let's build this tribe. The throne room stank of perfume and desperation. Illyria Voss stood at the edge of the grand hall where the marble met the shadows, where servants and the broken were permitted to exist as long as they remained invisible. Her hands clasped in front of her, knuckles white, nails digging crescents into her palms hard enough to draw blood. The pain kept her present, kept her from drifting into the numb fog that had become her only refuge. Around her, the court moved like a choreographed dance of predators. Silk gowns whispered against polished floors. Laughter sharp as broken glass cut through conversations about land acquisitions and bloodline purity. Nobody looked at her. They had trained themselves not to. Looking at Illyria Voss meant acknowledging failure, and in the empire of obsidian and gold, failure was contagious. She had been 12 when the transformation ceremony failed. Every child born to the noble houses underwent the ascension at 12, a ritual infusion of ancient power meant to awaken the dormant strength in their bloodlines. Some emerged with enhanced senses, others with unnatural speed or the ability to heal wounds that should have been fatal. The gifted ones became the backbone of the empire's military might, its ruling class, its future. Illyria had emerged from the ritual chamber unchanged, worse than unchanged, marked. A black fracture had spread across her left forearm like cracked obsidian, a permanent stain that announced to everyone what she was: defective, broken, a waste of noble blood and resources. Her family had kept her alive, barely, more out of shame than mercy. Killing her outright would have been an admission that their bloodline carried weakness. Better to let her fade into the background, a living ghost haunting the edges of their great hall. That was 6 years ago. 6 years of existing in the spaces between significance. 6 years of learning to make herself small, quiet, erasable. 6 years of enduring the casual cruelty that people inflicted when they thought you didn't matter enough to remember. Lady Soraya Kovrin was particularly skilled at that brand of cruelty. The noblewoman glided past Illyria now, her entourage trailing behind like jeweled parasites. Soraya's eyes flicked toward Illyria for just a moment, long enough to let her smile curl with contempt, before she turned to her companions and said something that made them laugh. The sound was wind chimes made of daggers. Illyria's jaw tightened. She knew what they were laughing about, the same thing they always laughed about. The girl too worthless to transform, the stain on her family's reputation. The reminder that even among the powerful, accidents happened. She had stopped caring about the mockery years ago. Or at least she had convinced herself she had stopped caring. The truth was more complicated, buried beneath layers of survival instinct and practiced numbness. The truth was that every laugh chipped away at something she couldn't afford to lose but didn't know how to protect. Her humanity, maybe. Or just the memory that she had once believed she mattered. The great bronze doors at the far end of the throne room swung open with a sound like thunder. Everyone stopped. Every conversation died mid-word. Every laugh choked into silence. Even the servants froze, their eyes dropping immediately to the floor in submission. King Valor Draven entered the hall. He did not walk. He inhabited space, claimed it, redefined it by his presence. 6.5 feet of controlled violence wrapped in black leather and ceremonial armor. A wolf among sheep who had forgotten they were prey. His face was all harsh angles, sharp jaw, blade-straight nose, eyes the color of winter storms. A scar cut diagonally across his left cheekbone, pale against his sun-darkened skin. A souvenir from the succession wars that had left him the last living heir to the obsidian throne. The court bowed as one, a wave of submission rippling through the hall. Illyria bowed too, dropping her gaze to the floor, making herself smaller, invisible, irrelevant. She had seen the king before, of course. Everyone had. He presided over the grand assemblies, made pronouncements about territorial expansion and military campaigns, accepted tributes from conquered territories. But he was a distant figure, a force of nature that existed on a plane far removed from the shadows where she lived. Today felt different. She couldn't explain why. Something in the air had shifted, some predatory awareness that made the hair on the back of her neck rise. She kept her eyes down, counting the seconds until he would pass, until the moment would end and she could breathe again. Boots on marble, getting closer. Her pulse hammered against her throat. The footsteps stopped, directly in front of her. Silence stretched like a wire pulled to breaking. The entire court held its breath. Slowly, so slowly her muscles screamed in protest, Illyra raised her eyes. King Vaelor Draven was looking at her, not through her, not past her, at her. His gaze was surgical, dissecting, cataloging. It stripped away the carefully constructed invisibility she had wrapped around herself like armor and exposed everything beneath, the exhaustion, the pain, the stubborn core of survival that refused to surrender even when surrender would have been easier. She forgot how to breathe. How long had it been since someone had actually seen her? Not the mark on her arm or the shame of her failure, but her. The girl beneath the brokenness. The human being who had learned to exist in the cracks of a world that had no space for weakness. Nobody spoke. The silence had teeth now, dangerous and sharp. Then Vaelor's expression shifted, barely, just a microscopic tightening around his eyes, and he moved past her, continuing toward the throne as if nothing had happened. The court exhaled. Conversations resumed, quieter now, more cautious. Soraya and her entourage huddled together, whispering furiously. Illyra could feel their stares burning into her back like brands. She had been noticed. By the king. That was not good. That was the opposite of good. In a world where survival depended on being overlooked. Being seen by the most powerful man in the empire was a death sentence, wearing a different mask. Her hands trembled. She locked them together, squeezed until her bones ached, forced the shaking to stop through sheer will. Whatever had just happened, she would bury it, forget it. Return to the shadows and pray the moment faded from memory like smoke. But deep in the primitive part of her brain where instinct lived, she knew the truth. Something had begun, and there was no stopping it now. The servants' quarters smelled like lye soap and suffering. Illyra pushed open the door to the small room she shared with 3 other girls, all of them low-born attendants, none of them cursed with noble blood that had failed to deliver on its promise. They looked up when she entered, their expressions careful, neutral. They had learned not to acknowledge her too openly. Association with failure could taint them by proximity. She didn't blame them. Survival made people cruel in small, necessary ways. Mira, the youngest, was mending a torn uniform by candlelight. She glanced at Illyra and then quickly away, her needle resuming its rhythm through fabric. The other 2, Kes and Jorin, were already in their bunks, faces turned to the wall, feigning sleep. Illyra moved to her corner, the smallest space farthest from the heating vent, and lowered herself onto the thin mattress that barely qualified as furniture. Her body ached. Everything ached. She had spent the morning hauling water for the scullery, the afternoon polishing silver in the grand dining hall, and the evening standing at attention during the court assembly. 18 years old, and her back already felt 40. She closed her eyes and tried to find the quiet place in her mind where nothing could touch her. The internal fortress she had built brick by brick over 6 years of systematic erasure. A knock shattered the silence. All 4 girls froze. Nobody knocked on the servant's door, ever. People either barged in with orders or ignored the room entirely. The knock came again, harder this time, deliberate. Mira's eyes went wide with fear. Kes sat up, her face pale. Jorin mouthed a prayer to gods Illyra didn't believe in anymore. Illyra stood. Her legs felt disconnected from her body, operating on some autopilot survival program. She crossed the room and opened the door. Captain Rivan stood in the corridor. The king's personal guard. 6 feet of military precision, dark skin marked with ceremonial scars, eyes that had seen battlefields and never flinched. He wore full armor despite the late hour, his hand resting casually on the pommel of the sword at his hip. He looked at Illyra the way you might look at a problem you had been ordered to solve. "His Majesty requests your presence," he said. His voice was gravel and iron. "Now." The world tilted. Illyra heard Mira gasp behind her, felt the weight of the other girl's terror pressing against her back. Her own heart had stopped beating, or maybe it was beating so fast she couldn't feel the individual pulses anymore. The king, requesting her presence, in the middle of the night. This was an execution. It had to be. You didn't survive being noticed by King Valor Draven. You certainly didn't survive being summoned to his private chambers after dark. She thought about running. The impulse flashed through her nervous system like lightning. Bolt past the captain, down the corridor, out into the night. Keep running until her lungs gave out, or the guards caught her, whichever came first. But running would only make it worse, would only confirm that she was guilty of whatever crime the king thought he had seen in her eyes. And if she was going to die, she would die on her feet, looking her executioner in the face. She had survived this long. She could survive the end. "I'll come," she said. Her voice didn't shake. Small victory. Captain Revon nodded once, turned, and started walking. She followed, leaving the door open behind her, not looking back at the girls who would wake tomorrow and find her bunk empty and pretend they had never known her name. The palace corridors at night were a different world, shadows pooled in corners where torchlight couldn't reach. The sound of her footsteps echoed against stone like a countdown. Captain Revon walked 3 paces ahead, not looking back, confident she wouldn't try to escape. He was right. They climbed stairs, passed through sections of the palace Illyra had only seen from a distance. The wing, where the noble families kept their private suites. The gallery lined with portraits of dead conquerors. The observatory where the king's advisors charted territorial expansion. Finally, they stopped in front of a door carved from black wood and reinforced with iron. The king's private study. Riven knocked twice, sharp and efficient. "Enter," came the voice from inside. Low, controlled, absolute. The captain pushed the door open and gestured for Illyra to go in. She stepped across the threshold and heard the door close behind her with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid. The study was smaller than she had expected. A fire burned in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across walls lined with maps and weapons. A desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered in reports, strategic documents, a half-empty glass of something dark and alcoholic. King Valor stood by the window, his back to her, looking out at the city below. The firelight caught the edge of his profile, turned him into something carved from stone and violence. He didn't turn around. Seconds passed. She counted them. 20, 30. Her heart hammered so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. Finally, he spoke. "What is your name?" Not a question. A command. Her throat had gone dry. She swallowed, forced the words out. "Illyra Voss, Your Majesty." He turned then, slowly, and the full weight of his attention fell on her like a physical force. Up close, he was even more overwhelming. Not just the size or the scars or the predatory grace of his movements. It was the intelligence behind his eyes, sharp, calculating, utterly devoid of mercy. He looked at her the way a wolf looks at wounded prey, assessing whether she was worth the effort of killing. 6 years, he said. "You've been in this palace for 6 years." And she didn't know how he knew that. Didn't know how to respond. So she said nothing, just stood there with her hands clasped in front of her, trying not to shake. 6 years of standing in corners, of being invisible, of being nothing. He moved closer, each step deliberate. She wanted to back away, but her body had locked in place, frozen by some primal instinct that understood running from apex predators only made them chase harder. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could smell the leather of his armor, the smoke from the fire. Something else underneath, iron and sweat, and the particular scent of a man who had spent his life turning people into corpses. "Tell me," he said quietly, "do you know what I see when I look at you?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "No, Your Majesty." His eyes narrowed. Not pity, not contempt. Something else entirely. Something that made her skin crawl with a sensation she couldn't name. "I see someone who has survived," he said, "every day in a world designed to erase them, who has endured humiliation, neglect, cruelty, and remained intact. Do you know how rare that is?" She couldn't speak, couldn't process what he was saying. It felt like a trap, like words meant to lure her into revealing something that would justify whatever punishment he had planned. "Most people break," he continued. "They shatter. They become bitter, vicious, desperate. They lose themselves trying to fight back or surrender. But you. He tilted his head slightly, studying her. You haven't broken. You've just endured. The word hung in the air between them. She didn't understand. Didn't understand why he was saying this, what he wanted, what game he was playing. Your Majesty, she managed. I don't... Who has hurt you? He interrupted. His tone had shifted, gone colder, sharper. Give me names. The question hit her like a slap. She stared at him, her mind struggling to catch up. Names. He wanted names. Of the people who had tormented her, the nobles who had made her existence a daily exercise in humiliation. Why? Why would the king care? Why would it matter to him what happened to a girl the empire had already thrown away? Unless this was the trap. Give him names and watch them destroy her family. Watch them strip away the last threads of protection she had, thin as they were. She stopped, started again. I don't know what your Majesty means. His jaw tightened. Don't lie to me. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, an expectation. She felt something crack inside her chest, some wall she had built to keep the truth contained, to keep herself functional. Because the truth was too big, too raw, too dangerous to let out. But he was looking at her like he already knew, like he could see through the careful performance of endurance to the wounds beneath. And for the first time in 6 years, someone was asking. Lady Soraya Covrin, she said. The words felt like glass in her throat. And Lord Theris, and Councillor Varen, and... She stopped. Her hands were shaking now, trembling so badly she couldn't control them. Valor's expression didn't change. He just listened, cataloging, recording. When she ran out of names, when the silence stretched too long, he nodded once. Thank you, he said. Then he turned and walked back to his desk, poured himself another measure of the dark liquid, drank it in one swallow. You may go, he said without looking at her. She stood there, frozen, trying to understand what had just happened, what she had just done. Elira, he said quietly, that is an order. She turned and walked to the door on legs that didn't feel like her own. Her hand found the handle. She pulled it open. His voice stopped her. If anyone touches you again, he said, you will tell me immediately. Do you understand? She looked back at him. He was still facing the desk, his back to her, shoulders tense. Yes, Your Majesty, she whispered. Good. She left. Walked through the corridors in a daze, down the stairs, back through the passages to the servants' wing, into her room where the other girls pretended to be asleep, and she collapsed onto her bunk and stared at the ceiling until dawn broke, and tried not to think about the fact that something fundamental had just shifted, that she had been seen, and the king had decided she mattered. The purge began 3 days later. Elira was in the scullery scrubbing pots when the first screams echoed through the palace. She froze, wrist deep in greasy water, as the sound of running feet hammered down the corridor outside. Shouts. Orders barked in military cadence, the distinctive ring of steel being drawn from sheaths. The head cook, a massive woman named Greta, who had worked in the palace for 30 years, went pale. Get down, she hissed at the scullery girls. All of you, under the tables, now. They scrambled to obey. Elira wedged herself between 2 flour barrels and a support beam, making herself as small as possible. Her heart pounded. This was a raid, or a coup, or an execution. Whatever it was, servants who got caught in the crossfire ended up dead. The screaming got louder, closer. Then Lady Soraya Covrin burst through the scullery door. Her perfect hair was disheveled, her silk gown torn at the shoulder, her face contorted with terror and rage. Behind her came Captain Rivon and 4 royal guards. No, Soraya shrieked. You can't. I'm of House Covrin. I have rights. I demand an audience with... The captain didn't slow down. He grabbed her arm with mechanical efficiency, twisted it behind her back, forced her to her knees on the stone floor. Lady Soraya Covrin, he said in that gravel-iron voice, you are charged with assault, conspiracy to harm a member of the royal household, and treason against the crown. Your family's titles are forfeit, your assets seized. You will be tried at the king's discretion. Soraya's face went white, then red, then white again. This is about her, she spat. The broken girl. You're destroying me over that worthless... Riven's fist connected with her jaw. Not hard enough to break bone, but hard enough to snap her head back and cut off the words. You will speak of her with respect, he said quietly. Or you will not speak at all. He hauled her to her feet and dragged her out of the scullery. The guards followed. The door swung shut. Silence. Greta slowly stood up, her face ashen. The other girls emerged from their hiding spots, eyes wide with shock. Illyra stayed where she was, pressed against the barrels, her entire body shaking. This is about her. The broken girl. Oh God. This was because of the names she had given. The people she had identified as her tormentors. The king had asked, and she had answered, and now they were being arrested, destroyed, erased. She was going to be sick. She made it to the waste bucket before her stomach emptied itself, heaved until there was nothing left but bile and tear. Greta appeared beside her with a cup of water. Drink, the older woman said gently. Illyra took the cup with trembling hands, sipped. The water tasted like ash. What happened? Mira whispered from across the room. Why did they take Lady Soraya? Greta shot her a warning look. We don't ask those questions, but we don't ask. The scullery fell silent again. Illyra set down the cup and forced herself to stand. Her legs felt like water, but she locked her knees, kept herself upright through sheer will. She had to find him, had to understand what he had done, what she had caused. But even as the thought formed, she knew it was pointless. You didn't just walk up to the king and demand explanations. You didn't question his actions or his motives. And yet, he had asked her for names, had looked at her like she mattered, had promised, if anyone touches you again, you will tell me immediately. This was him keeping that promise. This was protection, but it felt like annihilation. By nightfall, 7 nobles had been arrested. By the next morning, 2 were dead, executed for resisting capture. By the end of the week, House Kavrin was financially ruined, Lord Theris had fled the capital, and Councillor Varen was awaiting trial in the dungeons beneath the palace. The court walked on glass. Every conversation was whispered, every movement calculated. Nobody knew what had triggered the king's wrath, but rumors spread like wildfire through dry grass. Some said it was a coup attempt. Others claimed evidence of treason had been uncovered. A few whispered about corruption in the noble houses, bribes and embezzlement, and plots against the throne. Nobody mentioned Illyra. But everyone looked at her differently now, like she was a bomb waiting to explode, like proximity to her might detonate their entire existence. She kept her head down, worked her shifts, tried to disappear back into the shadows where she had lived for 6 years. It didn't work. On the 8th day, Captain Rivan appeared in the scullery again. This time, he didn't ask. He just said, "Come with me," and walked out expecting her to follow. She followed. They didn't go to the king's study this time. They went to the West Tower, up 3 flights of stairs, down a corridor lined with portraits of dead queens. He stopped in front of a door and pushed it open. "These are your quarters now," he said. Illyra stared. It was a bedroom, an actual bedroom, not a servant's closet or a shared bunk. A private room with a real bed, a wardrobe, a writing desk, a window that looked out over the gardens. "I don't understand," she said. The captain's expression didn't change. "His Majesty has decided you will no longer reside in the servants' wing. You will be provided appropriate accommodations, clothing, and education befitting your new status." "What status?" she whispered. Riven's jaw tightened slightly. "That will be explained when His Majesty deems it appropriate." He turned to leave. "Captain," she said. He paused. "Why is he doing this?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, without looking back, he said, "Because he believes you deserve to exist as more than a ghost." He left her standing in the doorway of a room that felt like a cage disguised as kindness. She didn't sleep that night, couldn't sleep, just sat on the edge of the bed, the real bed with actual sheets and a pillow that didn't smell like mildew, and tried to process the fact that her entire reality had been rewritten in less than 2 weeks. The king had destroyed her enemies, had given her a room, status, protection. Why? Not kindness. Valor Draven was not kind. Kindness required empathy, required seeing people as equals deserving of compassion. The king saw people as assets or threats or irrelevant. There was no middle ground. So what was she? An asset. That had to be it. He had seen something in her, some quality or potential that made her useful. And when you were useful to a king, you became valuable. Valuable enough to protect. Valuable enough to elevate. But useful for what? The thought terrified her more than the arrests, more than the executions, more than any of it. Because if she was valuable, she could become invaluable. And if she became invaluable, she would be trapped in a web of power and obligation that made her previous existence look like freedom. A knock on the door made her jump. "Come in," she said, her voice barely steady. The door opened. A woman entered, middle-aged, sharp-eyed, dressed in the formal attire of a senior palace attendant. "Miss Voss," she said with a slight bow, "I am Attendant Maurice. I've been assigned to assist with your transition." "Transition to what?" Elira asked. Maurice's expression remained neutral. "That will become clear in time. For now, His Majesty has requested you join him for dinner tomorrow evening. I will help you prepare." Dinner. With the king. This was getting worse by the second. "I appreciate the offer," Elira said carefully, "but I don't think that's—" "It was not a request," Maurice interrupted gently. "It was a command." "Right, of course it was." Elira nodded mutely. Maurice bowed again and left, closing the door with a soft click that sounded like a prison lock engaging. Elira sat in the silence and stared at the wall and felt the invisible chains tightening around her with every breath. She had survived 6 years in the shadows by being nothing, by asking for nothing, by expecting nothing. Now the king had decided she was something, and she had no idea how to survive that. The dinner was held in a private chamber adjacent to the throne room. Elira arrived wearing a dress Maurice had provided, simple but well-made, dark blue fabric that didn't draw attention but didn't scream servant either. Her hair had been brushed until it shone. Her nails cleaned. She looked almost presentable. She felt like a fraud. Captain Rivan escorted her to the chamber and opened the door without ceremony. "Go in," he said. She went in. The room was smaller than she had expected. Intimate. A single table set for 2. Candles burning low, casting warm light across stone walls. A fire crackling in the hearth. King Veilor stood by the window again. Same position as the first night. Same rigid posture. He turned when she entered. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the chairs. She sat, folded her hands in her lap to stop them from shaking. Waited. He moved to the opposite chair and lowered himself into it with the controlled grace of someone whose body was a weapon he had mastered long ago. For a moment, he just looked at her, that same dissecting gaze that stripped away pretense and left her exposed. Then he said, "You're afraid of me." Not a question, an observation. She thought about lying, decided against it. "Yes." "Good," he said. "Fear is rational. It keeps you alive." He poured wine into both glasses, deep red, expensive, and slid one across the table toward her. She didn't touch it. "I didn't summon you here to harm you," he said. "If I wanted you dead, you would already be dead." The bluntness of it should have been terrifying. Somehow it was almost reassuring. At least he was honest. "Then why am I here, Your Majesty?" "Because," he said, leaning back in his chair, "I need you to understand what happens next." Her stomach dropped. What happens next? He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "The Empire is watching. They know I moved against the nobles who tormented you. They know I gave you quarters in the palace proper. They are speculating, drawing conclusions, creating narratives." She swallowed hard. "What kind of narratives?" "The kind that make you a target," he said flatly. "Some will assume you are my mistress. Others will think you are a political pawn. A few will believe you are a spy I am using to root out dissent. All of them will be wrong, but that won't stop them from trying to destroy you to get to me." The room felt too small suddenly, too warm. She couldn't breathe. "Why?" she managed. "Why would you put me in that position? I was safe in the shadows. I was—" "Safe?" he interrupted. His voice had gone cold. "You were not safe. You were tolerated. There is a difference. And tolerance ends the moment it becomes inconvenient." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "I saw what they were doing to you," he said quietly. "Saw how they had broken you down piece by piece until there was almost nothing left. And I made a choice. To intervene. To protect you. Not because I am merciful. I am not. But because I will not allow my court to practice slow murder on someone who has committed no crime beyond being born imperfect. His words hit her like physical blows. You think this is about you, he continued. It is not. This is about power, about making it clear that in my empire, strength is not defined by bloodline transformation or noble heritage. It is defined by survival, by endurance, by the refusal to break when the world demands you shatter. He sat back, his expression hardening again. You survived, Elira Voss. That makes you stronger than most of the courtiers who mock you, and I will not tolerate them destroying something that has proven its worth simply because they are too blind to see it. She couldn't speak, couldn't think. The world had tilted sideways and she was falling. So here is what happens next, Veilor said. You will remain in the palace, under my protection. You will be trained in etiquette, politics, self-defense. You will learn to navigate this world not as a victim, but as someone who belongs in it. And when you are ready, you will stand in that court, and they will see you not as the broken girl they threw away, but as someone they underestimated at their own peril. No, she whispered. He raised an eyebrow. No? I can't. I'm not. What? He said. Strong enough? Worthy enough? Capable enough? All of it, she said desperately. I'm nobody. I'm nothing. I don't belong in that world and I never will. His expression shifted. For just a moment, something that might have been understanding flickered behind his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by iron resolve. You're wrong, he said simply. You belong anywhere you refuse to be erased from, and I am giving you the tools to make that refusal permanent. He stood, signaling the conversation was over. Captain Rivon will escort you back to your quarters, he said. Your first lesson begins tomorrow at dawn. She stood on shaking legs, her mind still reeling. Your Majesty, she said. Why? Why does it matter to you? What I am, what I become? He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, Because the world told you that you were worthless, and I have spent my entire life proving the world wrong about things it believes are absolute truths. Consider this, another campaign. He turned away, dismissing her without another word. She left the chamber in a daze. And as Captain Rivon walked her back through the silent corridors, one thought kept circling through her mind like a prayer or a curse. The king had decided she mattered, and there was no escaping that now, no matter how much she wanted to. The throne room had been built to intimidate. Vaulted ceilings that swallowed sound, columns carved from obsidian that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. The throne itself, a monstrosity of black stone and gold inlay, sat elevated on a dais like a judgment waiting to be passed. Every architectural choice was deliberate, every angle calculated to remind anyone who entered that they stood in the presence of absolute power. Elira walked down the center aisle flanked by Captain Rivon and 2 royal guards, her footsteps echoing against marble like a countdown. The court had assembled in full force. Hundreds of nobles lined the walls, their faces masks of curiosity and calculation. They watched her the way people watched public executions, hungry for spectacle, eager to see how the condemned would break. She kept her spine straight, kept her eyes forward. The combat master had drilled that into her over 3 weeks of brutal training. Posture is power, he had said, while she bled onto the practice mats. You walk like prey, you become prey. So she walked like something that refused to be eaten. At the far end of the hall, King Veilor sat on his throne. He wore full ceremonial armor today, black plate chased with gold, a cloak of midnight blue that fell across the stone like spilled ink. His expression was carved from granite, unreadable, absolute. To his right stood a man Elira had never seen before, Lord Cadron Voles. He was older than Veilor by perhaps a decade, his hair silver-streaked, his face lean and sharp as a blade. He wore no armor, just expensive civilian clothes, deep crimson coat, black leather gloves, boots polished to a mirror shine. But the way he stood spoke of battlefields survived and empires navigated. This was a man who had watched kings rise and fall and learned how to profit from both. His eyes locked onto Elira the moment she entered the hall, not with hatred, not with contempt, with interest, clinical, calculating. The way a master strategist looks at a new piece on the board, assessing value, vulnerabilities, potential applications. She forced herself not to look away, forced herself to meet that gaze with something other than fear, even though her heart was trying to hammer its way out of her chest. Captain Rivon stopped 10 feet from the dais. Elira stopped with him. The silence in the hall was suffocating. King Valor spoke first, his voice carrying effortlessly across the vast space. "Lord Cadrin, you requested an audience. You have it." Cadrin smiled. It was the kind of smile that made survival instincts scream warnings. Polite, friendly, lethal. "Your Majesty," he said, inclining his head in a bow that managed to be respectful and condescending at the same time. "I appreciate your indulgence. When I heard rumors of the recent restructuring of your court, I felt it prudent to return from my estates and see for myself what had prompted such decisive action." "Decisive," Valor repeated flatly. "An interesting word choice." Cadrin's smile widened. "I prefer precision in language, Your Majesty, just as you prefer precision in governance, which is why I find myself curious about the catalyst for recent events." His gaze shifted to Elira, lingered. "This young woman," he continued, "Elira Voss, if I am not mistaken, the girl who failed her ascension 6 years ago, who has lived in the palace as little more than a ghost, and who has somehow, in the span of a few weeks, become important enough to warrant the destruction of multiple noble houses." He paused, letting the words settle like poison. "Forgive my curiosity, Your Majesty, but I'm compelled to ask, what precisely makes her so valuable?" The court held its breath. Elira felt the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing against her skin, felt the razor edge of the moment cutting through whatever illusions she had built about safety or protection. This was the test. This was what Rivon had warned her about. Cadrin wasn't here to meet her. He was here to dissect her, to expose whatever weakness he thought the king had developed, to prove that Valor's judgment had been compromised by something irrational, emotion, desire, sentiment. And if he succeeded, if he convinced the court that their king had gone soft over a broken girl, the empire would fracture, loyalty would erode, challenges would emerge. She was the crack in the foundation, and Cadrin was here to drive a wedge into that crack until the entire structure collapsed. Valor's expression didn't change. His voice remained level, controlled, devoid of heat. "Miss Voss is valuable," he said, "because she has demonstrated qualities that most of my court lacks. Resilience, endurance, the ability to survive systematic erasure without surrendering her humanity. These are not common traits, Lord Cadrin, especially among the nobility." Cadrin tilted his head slightly. "Admirable qualities, certainly, but hardly unique. Many people endure hardship. It does not typically warrant elevation to a position of, what would you call it, Your Majesty? Favor?" The word dripped with implication. Valor stood. The movement was slow, deliberate, a predator rising to full height. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "Are you questioning my judgment, Lord Cadrin?" The strategist's smile never faltered. "Not at all, Your Majesty. I am simply trying to understand it. Because from where I stand, it appears that you have burned bridges, destroyed alliances, and created enemies within your own court, all for the sake of someone who, by every measurable standard, should be irrelevant." He gestured toward Elira without looking at her. "Surely, you can see how that might appear to those of us who have dedicated our lives to preserving the strength of this empire. It looks like weakness masquerading as principle." The court rippled with barely suppressed tension. Someone had just called the king weak. Not directly, but close enough that blood should have already been spilling. Valor descended the dais steps, one at a time, each footfall deliberate as a drumbeat. He stopped directly in front of Cadrin. The two men were nearly the same height, same breadth of shoulder, same aura of controlled violence. But where Valor was a storm barely contained, Cadrin was ice and calculation. "Weakness," Valor said quietly, "is believing that power can only be measured in bloodline and transformation. Weakness is destroying potential because it does not conform to expectation. And weakness, Lord Cadrin, is standing in my throne room and suggesting that you understand the nature of strength better than I do." Cadrin didn't flinch. "Then demonstrate it, Your Majesty. Show me why this girl is worth the cost you have paid." Valor turned, looked directly at Elira. His eyes were winter storms, unyielding, absolute. Miss Voss, he said, step forward. Her legs felt like they had been filled with lead, but she moved, one foot in front of the other, until she stood beside the king, directly in front of Lord Cadrin's dissecting gaze. Tell him, Valor said. Tell Lord Cadrin what you have learned these past 3 weeks. Her throat had gone dry. She swallowed, forced moisture back into her mouth, tried to find words that wouldn't sound pathetic or desperate. Cadrin was watching her with that clinical interest again, waiting for her to stumble, to prove his point. I have learned, she said slowly, that survival is not weakness, that enduring humiliation does not make you broken, and that the people who mistake silence for surrender are the ones who die surprised. Her voice was steadier than she had expected, harder. Cadrin's eyebrows rose fractionally. Interesting. And do you believe that makes you strong, Miss Voss? She met his eyes, held them, saw the trap he was laying. If she claimed strength, she was arrogant. If she denied it, she was worthless. So she said neither. I believe, she said carefully, that strength is not about what power you are born with. It is about what you do when power is taken from you. How you survive when the world has decided you should not. That is the strength that terrifies people like you, Lord Cadrin, because it cannot be inherited, it cannot be stolen, and it cannot be destroyed. The silence that followed was absolute. Cadrin's smile had frozen on his face. Behind him, the court was motionless, stunned, and King Valor, for just a moment, something that might have been approval flickered in his eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by the iron mask of authority. You wanted demonstration, Valor said to Cadrin. There it is, the value you questioned, the strength you could not see. He turned back to the court, his voice rising to fill the hall. Let it be known, he said. Alira Voss is under my protection. She will be trained, educated, integrated into this court not as a servant, but as someone who has earned the right to exist without apology. And anyone who questions that decision is welcome to challenge it directly. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. Directly, he repeated. With me. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The threat was implicit and absolute. Cadrin was the first to break the silence. He bowed again, that same dangerous smile back in place. You have made your position admirably clear, Your Majesty. I look forward to seeing how this experiment unfolds. He turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps measured and calm, but Alira saw it, the tension in his shoulders, the fractional tightening of his jaw. She had just made an enemy. No, she had just confirmed that she was already his enemy, and now he knew she was capable of fighting back. The court began to disperse, nobles filing out in clusters, their whispered conversations creating a low buzz of speculation and fear. Captain Rivon appeared at Alira's elbow. Come, he said quietly. His Majesty wishes to speak with you privately. She followed him out through a side door, away from the throne room, down a corridor that led to a smaller chamber she had never seen before. Valor was already there, standing by the window, his armor half removed. The ceremonial breastplate lay discarded on a chair. He looked tired suddenly, human in a way she had never seen him. You did well, he said without turning around. She didn't know how to respond to that, didn't know if it was true or just tactical encouragement. He believes I am your weakness now, she said instead. Valor turned, his expression unreadable. Yes. She waited for more. An explanation. A strategy. Something. But he just looked at her, that same surgical assessment she was becoming familiar with. Does that frighten you? He asked. Yes, she said honestly. Good. It should. Cadrin is the most dangerous man in this empire after me. He does not fight with swords or armies. He fights with perception, with narrative. And right now the narrative he is building is that I have compromised myself for something trivial. He moved closer, his presence filling the small room. So we must prove him wrong, he continued. You must become undeniable, not just resilient, not just strong, invaluable, so that when he tries to use you against me, he discovers he has miscalculated. How? She whispered. He studied her for a long moment. Then he said, by becoming exactly what they fear most. Someone who survived being nothing and learned how to weaponize that survival. The words should have felt empowering, should have felt like validation. Instead, they felt like chains wrapping around her chest, because she understood now what he was doing, what he had been doing from the beginning. He was not saving her. He was forging her, turning her into a blade he could use against his enemies. A living proof of concept that strength could be cultivated in places the Empire had dismissed as worthless. She was not a person to him. She was a statement, and the realization should have filled her with rage or despair or some combination of both. But instead, she felt something else entirely. Understanding. Because in a world where everyone was either a weapon or a target, being a weapon at least gave you agency, gave you the power to choose how you cut. Your Majesty, she said quietly, if I am to be your statement, your proof, then I need to know something. He waited. What happens when this proof is no longer needed? When the point has been made and the enemies have fallen, what happens to the weapon after the war? His expression shifted. Something almost like respect flickered behind his eyes. That, he said, is a question very few people are wise enough to ask. Most are too grateful to be chosen to consider what happens after. He stepped back, creating distance between them. I do not know the answer, Miss Voss, but I promise you this. You will not be discarded when your usefulness ends. That is not how I treat those who prove their value. It was not the reassurance she had hoped for, but it was honest. And in a world of calculated lies, honesty was its own kind of mercy. She nodded. Understood. Good, he said. Your next lesson begins at dawn. Attendant Maurice will prepare you. Dismissed. She bowed, awkwardly, still learning the proper depth and duration, and left the chamber. But as she walked back through the corridors toward her quarters, one thought circled through her mind with relentless clarity. She had just agreed to become a weapon, and weapons, no matter how valued, always ended up bloodied. The question was whether she would be bloodied by her enemies, or by the hand that wielded her. Eat. The weeks that followed were a systematic dismantling of everything Alara had believed about herself. Dawn training with the combat master, a scarred veteran named Torvin, who had no patience for weakness and less for excuses. He taught her not to fight like a warrior, but to survive like someone who understood that most battles were won before the first blow landed. How to read posture, how to exploit overconfidence, how to turn size disadvantage into mobility advantage. She learned that pain was just information, that exhaustion was negotiable, that the body could be pushed far beyond what the mind believed possible. Midday sessions with attendant Maurice covered court etiquette and political navigation, how to read a room, how to identify allies and enemies by the way they held their wine glasses or positioned themselves in conversations, how to speak in the language of implication and subtext that nobility used to maintain plausible deniability. She learned that words were weapons too, and that silence, deployed correctly, could cut deeper than insults. Evenings were reserved for education. History, economics, military strategy. A tutor named Vexus, who had served 3 kings and survived 2 coups, taught her how empires were built and destroyed, how loyalty was currency, how power was always one bad decision away from collapse. She learned that the world was more fragile than anyone wanted to admit, and that fragility made it more dangerous, not less. But the most brutal lessons came from the court itself. Because despite Valor's protection, despite his explicit warning, the nobles found ways to test her. Small cruelties dressed up as accidents, conversations that excluded her pointedly. Rumors spread just loud enough to reach her ears. She was the king's pet project, his charity case, his distraction. She was sleeping her way into favor, manipulating him with feminine wiles, playing the victim to exploit his guilt. She was a spy planted by enemy factions, a pawn in some larger game, a test of loyalty that would end in mass executions. The stories multiplied and mutated faster than she could track them. And through it all, Lord Cadron watched. He did not participate in the rumors, did not openly challenge her. But his presence was constant. At court assemblies, diplomatic functions, strategic meetings, always watching, always cataloging, building his case with the patience of someone who understood that empires were not toppled in a day, but eroded over time. One evening, 6 weeks into her new existence, Alira was leaving the library when she found him standing in the corridor, waiting. She stopped. Every muscle in her body tensed. Torvin's training kicked in automatically. Assess exits, calculate distances, identify potential weapons. But Kydron just smiled that dangerous smile and said, "Walk with me, Miss Voss." It was not a request. She fell into step beside him, keeping a careful distance, her senses hyper-aware of every movement he made. They walked in silence for several minutes, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Finally, he spoke. "You are more resilient than I gave you credit for." Most people would have broken under the pressure of the past 6 weeks. The scrutiny, the hostility, the constant evaluation. She said nothing, waited for the trap she knew was coming. "But you have not broken," he continued. "You have adapted, learned, grown stronger. It is actually quite impressive." He glanced at her, his eyes sharp. "Which makes you far more dangerous than I initially assessed." She forced herself to meet his gaze. "I am not dangerous to anyone, Lord Cadron." "No?" He stopped walking, turned to face her fully. "You do not think the king's obsession with you poses a danger to the empire? You do not think his willingness to destroy his own court for your sake suggests a fundamental instability?" She kept her voice level. "His Majesty made a strategic decision to eliminate corruption and cruelty within his own ranks. I was simply the catalyst." Cadron laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "You are a weapon aimed at the heart of this empire," he said quietly, "whether you know it or not. And when that weapon fires, people will die. Alliances will shatter. The stability we have built over decades will collapse." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "So I will offer you a choice, Miss Voss. Walk away. Leave the palace. Disappear into obscurity. I will arrange it. Safe passage to the southern territories. A new identity, enough coin to live comfortably for the rest of your life." She stared at him, her mind racing. This was the play. The elegant solution. Remove her from the equation and the king's apparent weakness disappears. Cadron gets to preserve the empire without directly challenging Valor. "And what happens if I refuse?" she asked. His expression hardened. "Then I will have no choice but to treat you as the threat you are. And I am very, very good at eliminating threats." It was not bluster. It was fact delivered with absolute certainty. She should have been terrified, should have considered the offer seriously. 6 weeks ago, she would have taken it without hesitation. But 6 weeks ago, she had still believed she was nothing. Now she knew better. "I am not leaving," she said. Cadron's eyes narrowed. "You would choose a king's protection over your own survival? That is foolish, Miss Voss." "No," she said. "I would choose to stop running from people who think I should not exist. That is survival." For a long moment, he just looked at her. Then he nodded slowly, something like respect flickering across his features. "Very well," he said. "Then we are enemies. And I want you to understand what that means." He stepped back, his posture shifting from conversational to formal. "I will not attack you directly. I will not hire assassins or arrange accidents. That would be crude. Instead, I will dismantle the foundation beneath you. I will show the court that the king's judgment is compromised, that his strength has been replaced by sentiment, and when the empire begins to doubt him, when the whispers become shouts, when his authority erodes, you will watch everything you have been given collapse." He smiled that terrible smile again. "And then, when you have nothing left, you will understand that you were never strong enough to survive in this world. You were just fortunate enough to find someone foolish enough to protect you." He turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into silence. Elira stood alone in the corridor, her heart pounding, her hands shaking, but not with fear, with rage. Because he was wrong. About her, about Valor, about everything, and she was going to prove it. She found the king in the training yard 2 hours before dawn. He was alone, working through combat forms with a practice sword, his movements precise and brutal. Sweat gleamed on his skin. His breathing was controlled despite the exertion. He saw her approach but did not stop. Just continued the pattern, strike, pivot, block, counter, with mechanical efficiency. She waited at the edge of the yard watching him move, seeing not the king, but the man beneath the crown. Someone who had survived his own version of erasure, who had fought his way to power through blood and will and the refusal to break. Finally, he completed the sequence and lowered the blade. "You should be sleeping," he said without looking at her. "Lord Cadron threatened me tonight," she said. That got his attention. He turned, his expression sharpening. She told him everything, the conversation in the corridor, the offer of escape, the promise of systematic destruction if she refused. Valor listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "What did you tell him?" "That I am not leaving." His eyes searched her face. "Why?" "Because," she said, "I am tired of other people deciding what I am worth. I am tired of running. I am tired of existing in the spaces between significance, and I am tired of being underestimated." She stepped closer, her voice hardening. "You asked me to become undeniable, to become the weapon that proves your point. Fine, I will do that, but not because you commanded it, because I choose it, because I want to stand in front of Lord Cadron and every noble who ever looked through me like I was glass and make them see me." Valor's expression was unreadable. For a moment she thought she had miscalculated, gone too far, revealed too much. Then he smiled. It was not the predatory smile he used in court, not the calculated expression that intimidated enemies. It was genuine, almost warm. "Good," he said quietly. "Fear makes you cautious, anger makes you sharp. But choice makes you dangerous." He set down the practice sword and moved toward her. "Cadron was right about one thing," he continued. "You are a weapon. But what he does not understand, what none of them understand, is that the most dangerous weapons are the ones that choose their own targets." He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the scars on his knuckles, the calluses on his palms, the evidence of every battle he had survived. "So choose," he said. "What do you want from this? What is the endgame that makes all of this worth it?" She had thought about that question every night for 6 weeks, had turned it over in her mind while she bled on the practice mats and stumbled through court etiquette and learned the brutal mathematics of power. And now, standing in front of the king at the edge of dawn, she finally had an answer. "I want them to remember," she said. "Every person who threw me away, every noble who decided I was worthless, every courtier who looked through me like I was nothing. I want them to see me stand beside you and realize they created their own enemy, that their cruelty did not break me. It forged me." Her voice was steady, cold, absolute. "I want to be the proof that they were wrong, and I want it to haunt them for the rest of their lives." Valor held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "Sharp. Definitive. Then that is what you will become," he said, "and I will give you every tool you need to make it happen." He turned and walked toward the armory, gesturing for her to follow. "Your real training begins now," he said. "Everything up until this point was preparation, testing, to see if you had the spine for what comes next." He pulled open the armory door and led her inside. The room was filled with weapons, swords, daggers, axes, bows, every tool of violence the Empire had perfected over centuries of conquest. But Valor walked past all of them, led her to a far corner where a small chest sat on a stone shelf. He opened it. Inside was a single object, a blade, not ornate, not ceremonial, just a knife forged from dark metal, the edge honed to surgical sharpness, the grip wrapped in worn leather. "This," Valor said, "belonged to my mother. She carried it when she was younger than you are now, when she fought her way through a court that wanted her dead because she was an outsider, a commoner who had somehow captured my father's attention." He lifted the blade, turned it in his hands. "She survived 19 assassination attempts," he continued, "not because she was strong, not because she was trained, but because she understood something fundamental about power." He looked at Elira. "That survival is not about avoiding the fight. It is about making sure every wound you take costs your enemy more than it costs you." He held out the knife. "Take it." She reached out slowly, her fingers closing around the grip. The blade was heavier than it looked, perfectly balanced. "Learn to use it," Valor said. "Not just the weapon, the philosophy. Make every attack against you expensive. Make every attempt to break you backfire. Become the cost they cannot afford." She looked down at the knife in her hands, saw her reflection distorted in the dark metal, and understood. This was not just a weapon, it was a promise that she would survive, that she would fight back, that she would make them regret underestimating her. "Thank you," she said quietly. Valor's expression softened, just for a moment. Then the mask of authority slipped back into place. "Train hard, Miss Voss. Lord Cadron will not wait long before making his next move. And when he does, you need to be ready to meet him not as a victim, but as a threat." She nodded, turned to leave. His voice stopped her at the door. "Elira." She looked back. He was standing in the center of the armory, surrounded by weapons, backlit by the first pale light of dawn creeping through the high windows. For a moment he looked almost human, almost vulnerable. Then he said, "You asked what happens to the weapon after the war. I still do not have a good answer, but I promise you this. Whatever happens, you will face it as someone who chose their own path, not as someone I created, not as a tool I wielded, as yourself." Something in her chest cracked, not breaking, opening. She nodded once, not trusting her voice, and walked out into the dawn. The palace did not burn. That would have been too obvious, too crude, the kind of violence that left evidence and created martyrs. Instead, it bled, slowly, quietly, from 1,000 invisible wounds that nobody could see until the floor was already slick with consequences. Alira stood at the window of her chambers and watched the city below transform, watched banners being torn down, watched noble carriages leaving through the gates in organized processions, watched the empire fracture in real time. 3 days since Lord Kydron had walked out of the throne room, 3 days since half the court had followed him, 3 days of watching everything Valor had built begin to collapse. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and tried not to think about the fact that this was her fault, that every noble who abandoned the king did so because he had chosen to protect her instead of sacrificing her to political necessity. The door opened behind her. She did not turn. Already knew who it was by the weight of his footsteps. "Captain Rivon." "Miss Voss," he said. His voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had not slept in 72 hours. "His Majesty requires your presence in the war room." War room, not study, not private chambers. They were past pretense now, past the illusion that this could be resolved through diplomacy or compromise. She turned. Rivon looked like he had aged a decade since the audience. New lines carved into his face, shadows under his eyes. The kind of weariness that came from watching something you had dedicated your life to defending start to crumble. "How bad is it?" she asked. He did not answer immediately, just looked at her with an expression that might have been pity or might have been resignation. "The Western provinces have declared neutrality," he said finally. "The northern trade routes are being blockaded by nobles loyal to Lord Kydron. We have lost contact with 3 military outposts, and this morning Duke Meravin sent formal notification that he is withdrawing his house guard from royal service." Each sentence was a hammer blow. Alira felt her chest tighten, felt the weight of the Empire's collapse settling onto her shoulders like a physical thing. "This is because of me," she said quietly. Rivon's jaw tightened. "This is because Lord Kydron saw an opportunity and exploited it. You are simply the catalyst he chose to use. That is not the same as innocent." "No," Rivon agreed. "It is not. But innocence is irrelevant now. What matters is what you do next." He gestured toward the door. "His Majesty is waiting." She followed him through corridors that felt different now, emptier. The servants who remained moved quickly, eyes down, terrified of being caught on the wrong side of history. The guards stood at their posts with the rigid tension of soldiers who knew battle was coming, but did not know when or from which direction. The war room was located deep in the palace's foundation, a stone chamber built during the succession wars designed to withstand siege and assassination. Maps covered every wall. A massive table dominated the center, its surface layered with reports, troop deployments, supply manifests. King Valor stood at the head of the table, his hands braced against the wood, staring down at the tactical layout of his fracturing empire. He looked up when she entered. For a moment, just a flash, she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of choices made and consequences manifesting. The particular kind of weariness that came from fighting battles you never wanted but could not avoid. Then the mask slipped back into place, and he was the king again. Absolute. Unyielding. "Miss Voss," he said, "thank you for coming." As if she had a choice. He gestured to the map spread across the table. "This is where we stand. 17 noble houses in open rebellion, 23 declared neutral, 41 still loyal. The military is split roughly 60-40 in our favor, but those numbers shift every day." He traced a line across the eastern territories. "Kydron has established a base of operations here, in the Obsidian Reach. Strategically brilliant, close enough to threaten the capital, far enough to avoid immediate confrontation. He is bleeding us through attrition, cutting supply lines, turning merchants against us. spreading the narrative that I have become unstable. Every word was delivered with surgical precision, no emotion, no wasted energy, but Alira could see the cracks beneath the surface, could see what this was costing him. "What do we do?" she asked. Baylor looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time since this began, she saw uncertainty in his eyes. "I do not know," he said quietly. The admission was devastating, not because it showed weakness, but because it showed truth. The invincible king, the predator who had conquered an empire, standing in front of a map of his own fracturing kingdom and confessing that he had no clear path forward. "We can fight," he continued. "Marshal the loyal houses. Call in the military units still under royal command. Turn this into open war. But that will destroy the empire, even if we win. Civil war always does." He moved around the table, his movements restless. "Caged. Or we can negotiate. Offer concessions. Find a middle ground that satisfies enough of the rebellion to prevent total collapse. But that requires giving Kadrin what he wants. Which means—" He stopped. Did not finish the sentence. Did not need to. "Which means sending me away," Alira said. Baylor's silence was answer enough. She felt something cold settle in her chest. Not surprised. She had known this moment was coming, had known from the beginning that eventually the cost of protecting her would become too high. The only question was when. "If I leave," she said carefully, "does the rebellion end?" Baylor exhaled slowly. "I do not know. Kadrin's position is that my judgment has been compromised, that I prioritize personal attachment over imperial necessity. If you disappear, it removes the most visible symptom. But the underlying doubt remains. The question of whether I can be trusted to make rational decisions. So sending me away might not even work." "It might not," he agreed. "But it is the only leverage we have that does not involve mass bloodshed." He turned to face her fully. "I told you I would not discard you," he said. "I meant that. But I also told you that you would face the consequences of your choices as yourself. Not as my creation, not as my tool. This is that moment, Alira. The choice is yours." She stared at him, tried to process what he was saying. "You are giving me the decision." "Yes." She felt her hands start to shake, clenched them into fists, forced the trembling to stop. "Why?" she demanded. "Why would you put this on me?" "You are the king. You make the decisions. You bear the weight. That is what power means." Baylor's expression shifted. Something almost like pain flickered behind his eyes. "Because," he said quietly, "I have spent my entire life making decisions for other people, sacrificing them on the altar of imperial necessity, watching them die for choices I made without their consent. And I am tired, Alira. I am tired of deciding who matters and who does not, who lives and who burns." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the scars on his jaw, the gray threading through his dark hair, the evidence of every battle and every burden. "So I'm giving you agency," he said. "Real agency, not the illusion of choice. If you want to leave, to save yourself and potentially save the empire, I will arrange it. Safe passage, protection, resources to build whatever life you want far from this madness." He paused. "But if you choose to stay, then you stay knowing the cost. Knowing that people will die because I refuse to sacrifice you. Knowing that the empire might collapse because I decided one person's life mattered more than political stability." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "That is not a decision I can make for you anymore." The silence that followed was suffocating. Alira felt the weight of the choice pressing down on her like a physical thing, felt the magnitude of what he was offering and what he was asking. Leave and maybe the empire survives. Maybe the bloodshed stops. Maybe Kadrin's rebellion loses its fuel and peace becomes possible again. Or stay and watch everything burn. Watch loyal soldiers die defending a king whose judgment had been compromised by something as irrational as seeing value in a broken girl. It should have been an easy choice. Survival always trumped principle. That was the first lesson this world taught. The only lesson that mattered. But standing there in the war room surrounded by maps of a fracturing empire, she realized something that terrified her more than death or exile or any of it. She did not want to run anymore, did not want to disappear back into obscurity and spend the rest of her life wondering what would have happened if she had been brave enough to stand her ground. Because running was survival. But it was not living, and for the first time in 6 years she wanted to live. "I am staying," she said. The words felt like stepping off a cliff. Valor closed his eyes. For just a moment his shoulders sagged with something that looked like relief and despair mixed together. Then he straightened. "Became the king again. So be it," he said. "Then we fight." Then he turned back to the map and began issuing orders to Captain Ryvan. Troop movements, supply routes, defensive fortifications, the mechanical precision of someone who had done this 100 times before. But Alira barely heard him, because she was too busy trying to process the fact that she had just chosen war over peace, had just decided that her existence mattered more than thousands of lives. The magnitude of that choice should have crushed her. Instead, it felt like the first real decision she had ever made. The attack came 4 days later, not on the palace. That would have been too direct, too much risk of failure. Instead, they hit the supply convoy heading to the northern garrison. 50 soldiers, dead in minutes, supplies burned, horses slaughtered. The message was clear. Kadrin could strike anywhere, anytime. The king's protection meant nothing outside the palace walls. Valor's response was immediate and brutal. He sent 2 full battalions to secure the northern routes, executed 3 nobles suspected of passing intelligence to the rebels, locked down the capital with martial law. But for every action he took, Kadrin had a counter. A blockade here, a defection there, a rumor planted in the right ear, a bribe offered to the right official. It was death by 1,000 cuts. Systematic dismantling disguised as strategy. And through it all, Alira watched from the edges, attended the war councils, listened to the reports, saw the map change color as more territories declared for the rebellion or withdrew into neutrality. She had thought staying would mean standing beside the king, fighting together, proving her worth through action. Instead, she was a spectator to her own irrelevance. Because this war was not about her, not really. It was about perception, about narrative, about whether the empire would follow a king who valued principle over pragmatism. And she was just the symbol they were fighting over. The flag neither side would lower. The realization was bitter as poison. 2 weeks into the conflict, she found herself in the palace library at midnight. Could not sleep, could not stop thinking about the casualty reports, the names of soldiers who had died defending supply routes or holding defensive positions, people who would still be alive if she had made a different choice. She was staring at a map of the empire when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned. Attendant Maurice stood in the doorway. The older woman looked exhausted, older, like the war was aging everyone in real time. "Miss Voss," she said quietly, "there is someone here to see you." Alira frowned. "At midnight? Who?" A figure stepped out of the shadows behind Maurice. "Lord Kadrin." Alira's hand went immediately to the knife at her hip, her mother's blade that Valor had given her. But Kadrin just raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I come unarmed," he said, "and under flag of truce. I simply wish to talk." She stared at him, tried to understand how he had gotten into the palace, how he had bypassed the guards and the security and the martial law lockdown. Then she saw Maurice's expression, the guilt and fear and desperate resignation. Understanding crashed over her like a wave. "You," Alira whispered, "you let him in." Maurice's face crumpled. "I am sorry," she said. "My daughter. They have my daughter in the obsidian reach. They said if I did not—" She stopped, started crying. Kadrin's expression was almost sympathetic. "I did warn you, Miss Voss, that I was very good at eliminating threats. Sometimes that means finding the cracks in armor you did not know existed." He gestured toward the chairs near the fireplace. "Please sit. This will only take a moment." Every instinct screamed at her to run, to call for guards, to put distance between herself and this predator who had just proven he could reach her anywhere. But she forced herself to move to the chair, to sit, to meet his eyes with something other than fear. "What do you want?" she said. Kadrin settled into the opposite chair with the ease of someone completely confident in their control of the situation. "I want," he said, "to offer you one final opportunity to end this, before it escalates beyond the point of return." She said nothing, waited. He leaned forward slightly. "I understand why you stayed," he continued. "The king gave you value, purpose, made you believe you mattered. And after 6 years of being nothing, that must have felt like resurrection. His voice was almost gentle, almost kind. But you need to understand what you have become, Miss Voss. You are not his companion, not his ally. You are his weakness, the crack in his armor that I am going to exploit until he breaks. I know what I am, she said coldly, and I am not leaving. Kadrin smiled. That terrible knowing smile. I suspected you would say that, which is why I came prepared with a different offer. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document, set it on the table between them. This is a confession, he said, signed by 3 members of the king's inner circle, including Captain Ryvon. Alira's heart stopped. A confession to what? Kadrin's eyes glittered in the firelight. To conspiring with me, to feeding me intelligence about the king's movements, his strategies, his vulnerabilities, to working as agents of the rebellion from inside the palace. No, Alira whispered. That is not possible. Ryvon would never betray the king? Kadrin interrupted. You are right, he would not. Under normal circumstances. He leaned back, studying her. But these are not normal circumstances. Captain Ryvon has served 3 kings, survived 2 coups, dedicated his entire life to preserving the empire. And he has watched the current king burn that empire to protect one girl who should not matter. His voice hardened. So when I approached him, quietly, carefully, through intermediaries, and offered him a choice between loyalty to one man and loyalty to the empire itself, he made the rational decision. Alira felt the world tilting beneath her, felt reality fracturing. You are lying, she said. This is a trick, a fabrication. Is it? Kadrin reached into his coat again, pulled out a second document. This one bore the royal seal. This is the palace security schedule, he said, updated daily, shared only with the king's most trusted advisors, including Captain Ryvon. He spread it on the table. Notice the annotations, the guard rotations, the vulnerable windows, all written in Ryvon's hand. Alira stared at the document, at the familiar sharp script, at the impossible evidence in front of her. Why are you showing me this? She whispered. Because, Kadrin said quietly, I want you to understand the truth, that everyone around you is making calculations, weighing costs and benefits, deciding where their loyalty truly lies. He stood. The king believes he is fighting for principle, for the idea that strength can be redefined, that value can be found in unexpected places. It is almost noble. His expression hardened. But principle does not feed armies. It does not maintain supply lines. It does not keep empires from collapsing. Pragmatism does. And the people who understand that, the people who actually keep the world functioning, will always choose survival over sentiment. He moved toward the door, paused. Captain Ryvon will be arrested tomorrow morning, he said, along with the others. The king will discover that his inner circle has been compromised, that the people he trusted most were working against him. He looked back at her. And when that happens, when he realizes how thoroughly he has been betrayed, he will finally understand what I have been trying to teach him. That trust is a luxury empires cannot afford. That mercy is just weakness with better marketing. And that protecting one broken girl was never worth destroying everything he built. He opened the door. Think about that, Miss Voss. When you watch his world collapse, when you see the cost of his choice manifesting in real time, ask yourself if you were really worth it. Then he was gone, disappeared into the shadows like smoke. Alira sat frozen in the chair, staring at the documents on the table. This could not be real, could not be true. But the evidence was there, undeniable, damning. Captain Ryvon, the man who had escorted her to the king, who had protected her, who had looked at her with something almost like respect, had been working for the rebellion, had been betraying Valor the entire time. She stood on shaking legs, moved to the door, had to warn the king, had to. But even as the thought formed, she knew it was pointless. Because if Ryvon was truly compromised, then going to Valor meant revealing that she had met with Kadrin in secret. Meant explaining how the rebel lord had walked into the palace undetected. Meant admitting that even her attendant, the woman assigned to help her transition, had been turned against them. The paranoia would be catastrophic. The king would trust no one. And the empire would fracture even faster. She pressed her back against the wall and slid down until she was sitting on the floor. And for the first time since this began, She let herself break. Let the tears come. Let the sobs tear through her chest. Let the weight of impossible choices crush her into something small and powerless. Because she finally understood what Kadrin had been trying to show her, that she had not chosen to stay out of strength. She had chosen to stay out of selfishness. And now people were going to die because she had wanted to matter more than she wanted to survive. The arrests happened at dawn. Alira watched from her window as Captain Rivan was dragged from his quarters in chains. Watched two other officers taken into custody. Watched the palace erupt into chaos and confusion and barely contained panic. Vialor emerged from the command center looking like death itself. His face was carved from rage and betrayal. His movements mechanical. Controlled violence barely leashed. He ordered an immediate investigation. Interrogations. A purge of anyone suspected of collaboration. The palace became a nightmare of accusations and confessions extracted through methods Alira did not want to imagine. And through it all, she stayed in her chambers, could not face him, could not look into his eyes and see the devastation of trust shattered. 3 days after the arrests, he came to her. She heard his footsteps in the corridor, heavy, purposeful, the walk of someone carrying unbearable weight. The door opened. He stood in the threshold, still in full armor, covered in the dust of the road. He had been riding to the northern front, inspecting defenses, trying to salvage what remained of his fragmenting military. "We need to talk," he said. His voice was flat, empty. She stood from the chair where she had been sitting for hours, faced him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Valor said, Rivan confessed. He has been passing intelligence to Kadrin for 6 weeks, since before the court assembly. Since before I gave you these quarters. Each word was a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples, disturbing the surface. He planned this, Valor continued. All of it. The rebellion, the fracture. He positioned people in my inner circle, turned them, fed me intelligence designed to make me paranoid or complacent depending on what served his strategy better. He moved into the room, started pacing like a caged animal. I have been fighting a war while my own people sabotaged me from within, he said. Every decision I made was compromised, every move countered before I could execute it, because the man I trusted most was destroying me from the inside. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Alira felt her chest tighten, felt the magnitude of his pain radiating like heat from a fire. I am sorry, she whispered. He stopped pacing, looked at her with eyes that had gone hollow. Why? He asked. You did not betray me. You have been nothing but honest since this began. So why are you apologizing? Because, she said, her voice breaking, if I had left when Kadrin first asked, none of this would have happened. Rivan would not have been turned. The court would not have fractured. You would not be... She stopped. Could not finish. Valor's expression shifted. Something that might have been understanding flickered behind the devastation. You think this is your fault, he said quietly. Is it not? No, he said. This is Kadrin's doing. This is the result of a man who sees human beings as game pieces and empires as puzzles to solve. You are not responsible for his choices. But I am responsible for yours, she said. You chose to protect me. And that choice broke everything. Valor was silent for a long moment. Then he said, Yes, I chose to protect you. But I did not choose blindly. I chose knowing the cost, knowing the risk. And I would make the same choice again. Even now? Even after all this? Yes. Why? She demanded. Why does one person matter more than an empire? Why does principle matter more than survival? He looked at her. Really looked at her. And she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Exhaustion that went bone deep. Weariness that transcended physical fatigue. Because, he said quietly, if the empire can only survive by sacrificing the powerless to appease the powerful, then it is already dead. It is just a machine running on momentum and cruelty. And I do not want to be king of that. His voice was barely above a whisper now. I have spent my entire life becoming what this world demanded. Ruthless, merciless, absolute. I have killed thousands, destroyed families, built mountains of corpses in the name of imperial stability. He moved closer. And I am tired, Alira. I am tired of being the monster the throne requires. I am tired of sacrificing people who do not deserve to be sacrificed. And when I looked at you, when I saw what they were doing to you, I saw a chance to draw a line, to say that this far and no further, that some things are worth protecting even if protecting them costs everything. Tears were streaming down her face now. She could not stop them. So if the empire collapses because I refuse to throw you away, he said, then it collapses. And I will rebuild something better from the ashes. Or I will die trying. He reached out, gently wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. You are not the weakness they think you are, he said. You are the reminder that I am still human beneath the crown. And I will not surrender that. Not to Cadron, not to the court, not to anyone. She broke, collapsed against him. Let him catch her. Let herself be held by someone who had chosen her over the world and was paying the price in blood and betrayal. And in that moment, she understood something fundamental. That this was not about her worth or her value, or whether she deserved protection. This was about who Valor chose to be when the cost of humanity became unbearable, and he had chosen to stay human, even if it destroyed him. 1. The final blow came 3 days later, not from Cadron, not from the rebellion, from within. Duke Sareth, one of the most powerful loyal houses, requested emergency audience with the king. Valor received him in the throne room, full court, full ceremony. Illyra stood at the edge of the hall as she always did, watching, waiting. The Duke entered with his retinue. His face was grim, determined. Your Majesty, he said, I come on behalf of the loyal houses. We have discussed the current situation extensively, and we have reached a consensus. Valor's expression was carved from stone. Speak. The Duke took a breath. We understand your principles, Your Majesty. We respect your commitment to protecting Miss Voss. But the Empire is collapsing. We are losing territories daily. The military is hemorrhaging deserters. Trade is ground to a halt, and the people are beginning to starve. He paused. We cannot continue this way. The cost is too high. So, Valor said flatly, you want me to send her away? No, Your Majesty. The Duke's voice hardened. We want you to abdicate. The word detonated like a bomb in the silent hall. Abdicate, Valor repeated. His voice was dangerously quiet. Yes, the Duke said. Step down. Hand power to a regent council that can negotiate peace with Lord Cadron. End the war before the Empire is destroyed beyond repair. And if I refuse, then the loyal houses withdraw their support, the Duke said. And you rule over a palace and nothing else. Illyra felt the floor disappear beneath her. This was it. The endgame Cadron had been building toward. Not just defeating Valor, but forcing him to surrender the throne. To prove that principle was meaningless when power evaporated. Valor stood, descended the dais, moved toward the Duke with predatory grace. You believe, he said softly, that I will surrender my crown to save an empire that demands I sacrifice my humanity? I believe, the Duke said carefully, that you will do what is necessary. Necessary, Valor repeated. He turned, looked directly at Illyra, and she saw it in his eyes, saw the question, the choice, the impossible decision. He could fight, could refuse, could hold on to power through force and watch the empire burn, or he could surrender, could give them what they demanded, could sacrifice himself instead of her. And in that moment, Illyra understood what she had to do, what she should have done from the beginning. She stepped forward, walked across the throne room floor, felt every eye in the hall lock onto her. She stopped in front of the king. Your Majesty, she said clearly, I am leaving. Valor's expression fractured. No. Yes, she said. This ends now. I am leaving the palace, leaving the capital, disappearing, and you are going to let me. She turned to face Duke Sareth. Will that be enough? If I remove myself from the situation, will the loyal houses stand with the king? The Duke looked uncomfortable. That would certainly help negotiations. Answer the question, she snapped. Yes or no? Yes, he said finally. If you're gone, we can present a unified front. Make peace with Lord Cadron. Rebuild. She turned back to Valor. Then it is done, she said. His hands were shaking. She had never seen him shake before. Illyra, he said, do not do this. You told me, she said quietly, that the choice was mine. that I would face the consequences as myself. This is my choice. She reached up, placed her hand against his cheek. You have been human enough, she said. You have proven your point. Now let me prove mine. Which is what? That survival is not surrender, she said, and that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away. She stepped back, turned to Captain Rivan's replacement, a young officer named Kael. Arrange transport, she said. I leave within the hour. Then she walked out of the throne room, did not look back, could not look back. Because if she did, she would see the king breaking, and she could not survive that. She made it to her chambers before the tears came. Made it through packing a single bag with essentials. Made it through changing into travel clothes. Made it through strapping her mother's blade to her hip. Then she collapsed onto the bed and wept until her chest ached and her throat was raw. There was a knock on the door. Come in, she managed. Valor entered, closed the door behind him, stood there looking more lost than she had ever seen him. I cannot let you do this, he said. You cannot stop me, she replied. He moved closer, sat on the edge of the bed. If you leave, he said quietly, I lose. Everything I fought for, everything I tried to prove, it all becomes meaningless. No, she said. If I leave, you survive. The Empire survives. And maybe that is the point. Maybe survival is the only principle that actually matters. She looked at him. You gave me agency, she said, real agency. Now I am using it, and you have to live with that. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, Where will you go? Somewhere far from here, she said. Somewhere I can build a life that does not involve being the symbol of someone else's war. He nodded slowly, as if accepting the inevitable. I will send protection, he said. Resources. Anything you need. I do not want your protection anymore, she said gently. I just want to be free. Another silence. Then Valor reached into his pocket, pulled out a small object, set it on the bed between them. It was a ring, simple metal band engraved with the royal seal. If you ever need anything, he said, ever, you present that to any royal outpost and they will provide whatever you require. No questions asked. She picked up the ring, turned it in her fingers. Thank you, she whispered. He stood, moved toward the door, stopped. Alira, he said without turning around. Yes? You were worth it, he said quietly. Every cost, every consequence. You were worth it. Then he was gone, and she was alone with the weight of a choice that felt like death and freedom mixed together in equal measure. An hour later, she walked out of the palace. The carriage was waiting. Officer Kale stood beside it, his expression carefully neutral. She climbed inside, settled into the seat, looked out the window at the palace she had called home for 3 months. The carriage started moving. And as the gates closed behind her, Alira Voss understood that she had just lost everything and gained everything in the same moment. She was free, she was alone, and she had absolutely no idea what kind of person she would become now that she was no longer anyone's weapon. The future opened in front of her like an abyss. She took a breath and stepped forward into it. The carriage had traveled less than 10 miles when the ambush happened. Alira heard it before she saw it, the sudden thunder of hoofbeats converging from multiple directions, the sharp commands shouted in military cadence, the unmistakable sound of steel being drawn from sheaths. Officer Kale's voice cut through the noise. Brace yourself! The carriage lurched violently as the horses were forced to a halt. Alira grabbed the seat to keep from being thrown against the wall. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct Torvin had drilled into her during training screamed warnings. She reached for her mother's blade, wrapped her fingers around the grip, felt the familiar weight center her. The door was ripped open. A face appeared. Not a soldier, not a royal guard, one of Kadrin's men. She recognized the crimson and black livery. Miss Voss, the man said with mock courtesy, Lord Kadrin requests the pleasure of your company. It was not a request. She could see Officer Kyle through the open door. On his knees, blade at his throat, 3 men surrounding him. His eyes met hers, young face twisted with rage and helplessness. Do not resist, he said through gritted teeth. They will kill you. The man at the carriage door smiled. Smart boy. Now come along, Miss Voss. We have a schedule to keep. Alira looked at the blade in her hand, looked at the soldier holding Kyle hostage, ran the calculations. She could fight. Could try to take down the man at the door, maybe get to Kyle, maybe create enough chaos to escape. And she would die in seconds. Or she could surrender, see where this led, buy time to find a better opening. Survival first, always. She set the blade on the seat, raised her hands, stepped out of the carriage. The man grabbed her arm with bruising force, dragged her toward a waiting horse, lifted her onto the saddle, and climbed up behind her. The last thing she saw before they rode away was Officer Cale's face, guilt and failure, written across every feature as he watched the girl he was supposed to protect disappear into the hands of the enemy. Botek. They rode for hours, through forest trails and mountain passes, away from the capital, away from any hope of royal intervention. Alira's mind raced. Kadrin had planned this, had known she would leave, had positioned his people along every possible escape route and waited for her to walk into the trap. Of course he had. The man was a strategist, and she had just made the most predictable move possible. By the time they reached the encampment, her wrists were raw from the rope binding them, and her body ached from hours on horseback. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and ash. The camp was massive, hundreds of tents arranged in military precision, soldiers moving with purpose, supply wagons being unloaded. This was not a rebellion. This was an army. They dragged her through the camp toward a large command tent at the center. Soldiers stopped to stare. Some looked curious. Others looked hungry in a way that made her skin crawl. The tent flap opened, and she was shoved inside. Lord Kadrin sat at a field desk reviewing documents. He did not look up when she entered, just continued reading as if she were an expected delivery that required no immediate attention. Finally, he set down the papers and looked at her. "Miss Voss," he said. "Welcome. I trust the journey was not too uncomfortable." She said nothing, just met his eyes with as much defiance as she could summon while bound and exhausted. He smiled, still fighting. "Good. I would have been disappointed if you surrendered completely." He stood, moved around the desk, circled her slowly. "I assume you are wondering why I went through the trouble of capturing you when you were already leaving the capital, when you had already given me exactly what I wanted." The question hung in the air. "Because," he continued, "your departure solved only half my problem. It removed you from the king's side, but it did not break him. And I need him broken, Miss Voss. Completely, irreparably, so that when I negotiate his abdication, he has no strength left to resist." He stopped in front of her. "You are the instrument of that breaking," he said quietly. "The final piece, the leverage that will force him to surrender everything." She found her voice. "If you hurt me, he will come for you, and he will not negotiate. He will destroy you." Kadrin's smile widened. "Yes, he will come. That is precisely what I am counting on." He gestured to the guards. "Take her to the holding area. Keep her comfortable. She is valuable cargo." They dragged her out of the tent, through more rows of soldiers, to a smaller tent at the edge of the camp heavily guarded. Inside was a cot, a bucket of water, nothing else. They cut the ropes from her wrists and shoved her inside. The tent flap closed. She heard guards positioning themselves outside. She was alone. And for the first time since the carriage had been stopped, she allowed herself to feel the fear, not for herself. She had made peace with the possibility of death the moment she had chosen to stay in the palace all those weeks ago. But for Vialor, for what Kadrin would do to him, for the trap that was being laid with her as the bait. She sat on the cot and pressed her face into her hands and tried to think. There had to be a way out, had to be a way to warn him, had to be something she could do besides wait for the inevitable. But the walls of the tent felt like the walls of a tomb, and no matter how hard she searched for an escape, she could not find one. The message reached Vialor at dawn. He was in the war room reviewing defensive positions when Officer Kael was brought in, bloodied, exhausted, barely able to stand. The young officer dropped to his knees in front of the king. "Your Majesty," he said. His voice was raw, broken. "They took her. Ambushed us on the northern road. I failed." Valor's expression went from stone to murder in the space of a heartbeat. "Who took her?" he said, each word precise as a blade thrust. "Kadrin's forces?" Kael managed. "They were waiting. They knew the route. They knew—" He stopped. Could not continue. Valor's hands were shaking, not with fear, with rage so absolute it had transcended emotion and become something closer to natural disaster. "How many?" he said. 20. Maybe more. I could not. Where? Cale pulled a bloodied scrap of fabric from his armor. It bore markings, coordinates. "They left this," he said, "wanted us to find it. It is a location in the Obsidian Reach, Cadron's stronghold." "A trap," said Duke Sareth, who had been standing silently in the corner. "He wants you to come after her, to abandon the capital, to leave yourself exposed." Valor turned, looked at the Duke with eyes that had gone arctic. "I am going after her," he said. "Your Majesty, that is exactly what he wants. I am going after her." Each word was a hammer blow. The Duke opened his mouth to protest, saw the expression on Valor's face, closed his mouth. Because this was not a king speaking anymore. This was something primal, something that existed beneath crowns and strategy and imperial necessity. This was a man who had made a promise and would burn the world to keep it. Valor turned to the remaining officers. "Assemble every loyal unit within a day's march. Full combat deployment. We leave within the hour." "Your Majesty," one of the officers said carefully, "if we pull forces from the defensive perimeter, then the capital is vulnerable," Valor finished. "I know. Do it anyway." "But—" "That is an order," Valor said. His voice had gone quiet, deadly. "Move. Now." They moved. Within an hour, the palace was a storm of activity. Soldiers mobilizing, horses being saddled, weapons distributed, supply wagons loaded. Duke Sareth found Valor in the armory, strapping on battle gear. "This is madness," the Duke said. "You are abandoning everything we fought to preserve, everything she left to protect." Valor did not look up, just continued methodically securing armor plates. "She left," he said quietly, "because she believed it would save the Empire, because she thought her sacrifice would be enough. But Cadron does not want peace. He wants domination, and he will not stop until I am broken or dead." He picked up his sword, the blade that had ended the succession wars, that had carved an empire from chaos. "So I will give him what he wants," Valor continued. "I will ride into his trap. I will bring every soldier loyal to me, and I will destroy him so completely that no one will ever question my authority again." He finally looked at the Duke. "Or I will die trying. Either way, this ends." The Duke stared at him, saw the absolute certainty in his eyes, the complete absence of doubt or hesitation. "You love her," the Duke said quietly. It was not a question. Valor's expression shifted. Something that might have been pain flickered across his features. "Love is a word for something gentle," he said. "What I feel is not gentle. It is the recognition that she is the last piece of my humanity I am willing to defend. And if I surrender that, if I let Cadron take her and do nothing, then I am no longer a man. I am just the crown, just the machine, just the thing I spent my entire life trying not to become." He moved toward the door. "Sagit." "So yes," he said, "I am riding into a trap. I am risking everything. I am gambling the Empire on one person, and I do not care." He stopped, looked back. "Because some things are worth more than empires," he said. "Some things are worth burning the world to protect. And if you cannot understand that, Duke Sareth, then you have never been human enough to deserve the crown." Then he was gone, striding through the corridors toward the courtyard where his army was assembling. The Duke stood alone in the armory and realized he was watching either the greatest act of courage he had ever witnessed, or the final chapter of a king destroying himself for love. The army rode hard. 3,000 soldiers, 200 cavalry, supply wagons struggling to keep pace. They moved through the day and into the night, pushed the horses to the edge of collapse, stopped only when absolutely necessary. Valor rode at the front, silent, focused, a storm given human form. The soldiers whispered among themselves. Some thought the king had gone mad. Others believed this was tactical genius disguised as recklessness. A few understood the truth, that this was neither madness nor strategy, but something more fundamental. This was a man reclaiming something that had been taken from him, and the fact that reclaiming it might cost everything only made the need more absolute. By dawn of the second day, they reached the Obsidian Reach. The fortress rose from the blackstone cliffs like something carved by violence. Walls 50 feet high, guard towers at every corner, a single gate reinforced with iron and spellwork, and arrayed in front of it, Kadrin's army. 5,000 soldiers, maybe more, positioned in perfect defensive formation, waiting. Valor raised his hand. The royal army stopped. 3,000 facing 5,000 across a field that would soon be soaked with blood. A single rider emerged from Kadrin's lines, rode forward carrying a white flag. The rider stopped halfway across the field, shouted loud enough for both armies to hear. Lord Kadrin offers terms. Send forward a representative for parley. Valor did not hesitate, did not consult his officers, just spurred his horse forward. Your Majesty, no! One of the commanders started. Valor ignored him, rode across the field alone, stopped 10 feet from Kadrin's messenger. The messenger was young, nervous, clearly not expecting the king himself. Lord Kadrin requests your presence in the fortress, the messenger said, to negotiate terms. He guarantees your safety under flag of truce. Valor's smile was a predator's smile. I am certain he does. Tell your master I accept. On one condition. The messenger swallowed hard. What condition, Your Majesty? I see Miss Voss first, alive, unharmed, or there will be no negotiation, only slaughter. The messenger nodded, turned his horse, rode back. Valor sat on his horse in the middle of the field and waited. Behind him, his army held formation. Tense. Ready. Every soldier knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether they fought or died. 20 minutes passed. Then the fortress gates opened. A figure was led out. Small, dark hair whipping in the wind, hands bound. Elira. Even at this distance, Valor could see she was alive. Could see the way she held herself, spine straight despite the bindings, still fighting, still unbroken. Something in his chest cracked. Not breaking, reinforcing. The messenger returned. Lord Kadrin will see you now, Your Majesty. You may bring 2 guards. No more. Valor turned, gestured to 2 of his senior officers. They rode forward. Together, the 3 of them crossed the field toward the fortress. As they approached, Elira's eyes met Valor's. For just a moment, her composure fractured. Relief and terror and something else flickered across her face. Then the guards pulled her back inside and the gates closed. Valor and his escorts entered the fortress. The interior was exactly what he had expected. Functional, military, no decoration, no luxury, just stone and iron and the smell of violence preparing to happen. They were led through corridors to a great hall where Kadrin waited. The strategist stood in the center of the room, relaxed, confident, surrounded by 24 armed soldiers. Your Majesty, he said with false warmth, thank you for accepting my invitation. Valor said nothing, just looked at him with eyes that promised death. Kadrin smiled. Straight to business, then. Excellent. I appreciate efficiency. He gestured to a door at the side of the hall. It opened. Elira was brought in, still bound, flanked by guards. She looked exhausted. There were bruises on her wrists from the ropes, but her eyes were clear. Defiant. As promised, Kadrin said, alive and unharmed. Now, let us discuss terms. There are no terms, Valor said. You release her, you surrender your forces, you submit to imperial justice, or I burn this fortress to the ground with you inside it. Kadrin laughed. It was genuine amusement, such conviction, such absolute certainty. This is why I have always admired you, Your Majesty. You truly believe that force of will can overcome tactical disadvantage. He moved closer. But let me explain your situation, he said. You have 3,000 soldiers. I have 5,000. You are inside my fortress, surrounded by my forces. Your supply lines are overextended. Your capital is undefended. And even if you somehow win this battle, which you will not, you will have nothing left to rule. He paused. So here are the actual terms. You abdicate. Publicly. You acknowledge that your judgment was compromised. You name a regent council to assume power, and in exchange I allow you and Miss Voss to leave. Together. Alive. Free to build whatever life you want far from the Empire. The offer hung in the air. Elira stared at Valor. willing him to take it, to choose survival over pride, to let the empire go if it meant living. But she saw the answer in his eyes before he spoke. "No," Valor said. Kadrin's smile faded. "No, I will not abdicate. I will not surrender my crown to a man who believes power is simply a matter of tactical superiority, and I will not allow you to dictate the future of an empire you do not understand." His voice dropped, became something colder than winter. "So here are my terms. You release Elira. Now. You disband your forces, and you pray that I am merciful when I decide your punishment. Because if you harm her, if you touch her, if you cause her one moment of additional suffering, I will show you what happens when a king stops pretending to be civilized." The hall erupted. Kadrin's soldiers moved forward, weapons raised, ready to cut down the king and his two guards where they stood. But Kadrin raised his hand, stopped them. "You would die for her," he said. "You would throw away everything, the crown, the empire, your own life, for one girl who should not matter." "Yes," Valor said simply. Kadrin studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Very well," he said. "Then you have made your choice. And I have made mine." He turned to his soldiers. "Take the king to the holding cells, his officers as well. Prepare for—" Elira moved. It was not a conscious decision, not a plan. Just pure instinct born from 3 months of training and 6 years of learning to survive when the odds were impossible. She drove her elbow backward into the gut of the guard behind her, felt him double over, ripped her bound hands forward, and grabbed the knife at his belt. The blade was in her hand and slicing through the ropes around her wrists before anyone could react. Then she was moving, toward Valor, toward the one person in this nightmare who had ever made her feel like she mattered. Kadrin's soldiers converged. Valor drew his sword. His 2 officers moved to flank him, and the hall exploded into chaos. Steel clashed against steel. Bodies collided. Blood sprayed across stone. Elira fought her way through the confusion, used every dirty trick Torvin had taught her, went for eyes and throats and groins, fought like someone who had nothing left to lose. She reached Valor's side. He grabbed her arm, pulled her behind him as he cut down 2 soldiers. "We need to move," he said. "Now." They fought toward the door, Valor's officers providing cover, bodies falling, the sound of combat filling the hall like thunder. They burst through the door, into the corridor, Kadrin's voice shouting orders behind them. The fortress erupted into violence, soldiers pouring from barracks, alarms ringing, the machine of war engaging with brutal efficiency. Valor and his people ran, through corridors, upstairs, toward the fortress walls where his army waited outside. "We have to signal them," one of the officers said. "Get them to breach the gates." Valor was already moving, found a window, grabbed a torch from the wall, thrust it through the opening and waved it in the prearranged pattern. Attack, now, full assault. Outside, the royal army saw the signal and charged. 3,000 soldiers hit Kadrin's defensive line like a battering ram, cavalry at the front, infantry behind, pure desperate aggression against superior numbers. The sound of war drums echoed across the valley, the clash of armies meeting, the screams of men dying. The fortress shook as siege equipment began hammering the gates. Kadrin appeared at the end of the corridor, flanked by soldiers. His face was fury and calculation. "You think this changes anything?" he shouted. "You are still trapped, still outnumbered, still—" The gates exploded inward. The sound was catastrophic. Wood and iron and stone detonating as the royal army's battering ram punched through reinforced barriers that should have held for days. Valor's soldiers poured through the breach, flooded into the fortress, met Kadrin's forces in brutal close-quarters combat. Valor grabbed Elira's hand, ran toward the breach, his officers clearing the path with ruthless efficiency. They reached the shattered gates, stepped out into a battlefield that had descended into pure chaos. Everywhere Elira looked, there was violence. Men fighting, dying. The ground slick with blood, and worse, the air thick with smoke and screaming. She had never seen war before. Not like this. Not the reality of it. The absolute horror of human beings tearing each other apart. Valor pulled her toward the command position where the royal banner still flew, where the last intact units were forming defensive perimeter. They almost made it. Then Kadrin appeared. He came from the side, sword already swinging, going for Valor's exposed flank. The king spun, caught the blade on his own. The impact sent shockwaves through both men. They separated, circled. Two apex predators recognizing that all the strategy and all the armies and all the politics had finally reduced to this. One-on-one, blade to blade. Winner determines the future. Illyra stumbled back, watched in horror as the two men engaged. They moved like violence made flesh, each strike designed to kill, each block barely adequate. This was not sparring. This was murder attempting to happen. Valor was bigger, stronger, but Kadrin was faster, more technical. The strategist slipped inside Valor's guard. His blade found flesh, opened a line of red across the king's ribs. Valor did not slow, just countered with a strike that would have decapitated Kadrin if the man had been a half-second slower. They broke apart, both bleeding now, both breathing hard. Around them, the battle raged. But in this moment, in this space, there was only the duel. "You cannot win," Kadrin said. "Even if you kill me. Even if you take this fortress. You have lost too much. The Empire will never forgive this." Valor's response was to attack. A combination of strikes so fast they blurred together. Kadrin barely held them off. The strategist's foot slipped on blood-slick stone. Just for a moment, just enough. Valor's blade found his shoulder, bit deep. Drew a scream. Kadrin staggered back, his sword falling from suddenly nerveless fingers. It was over. Valor stood over him, blade raised, ready to deliver the killing blow. "Do it," Kadrin said. His voice was pain and defiance. "Prove that you are just another tyrant, just another monster wearing a crown." Valor's hands were shaking. The blade trembled in the air, and Illyra saw it, saw the moment of choice, the precipice. Kill Kadrin and prove that violence was the only language power understood, or spare him and prove that mercy still existed even in the heart of war. "Your Majesty," she said quietly. Valor looked at her. His eyes were wild, desperate, searching for guidance in a situation that had no right answers. She held his gaze, said nothing, because this was not her choice to make. This was his. The moment stretched, time itself holding its breath. Then Valor lowered the blade. "You live," he said to Kadrin, "not because I am merciful, but because killing you would make you a martyr. And I will not give you that satisfaction." He turned to his soldiers. "Take him to the dungeons. He will face trial for treason. Let the law decide his fate." Kadrin laughed. Even bleeding and defeated, he laughed. "You are a fool," he said, "a sentimental fool, and that weakness will destroy you." Valor did not respond, just walked away. Toward Illyra. Toward the girl who had somehow become the center of his world. He reached her, pulled her into his arms, held her like she was the only thing keeping him tethered to humanity. And around them, the battle finally began to wind down. Kadrin's forces were collapsing, surrendering. The fortress was taken. The rebellion was broken. But as Illyra stood there in the king's embrace, surrounded by carnage and victory, she knew one truth with absolute certainty. This was not the end. This was just the beginning of consequences that would reshape everything, and the hardest choices were still ahead. The throne room had never felt colder. Illyra stood at the edge of the hall where she had stood so many times before, in the shadows, at the margins, where the forgotten were permitted to exist as long as they remained invisible. But this time was different. This time every eye in the court was on her, not looking through her, not dismissing her, seeing her. And the weight of that attention was suffocating. 3 weeks had passed since the battle at Obsidian Reach. 3 weeks of burying the dead, of counting the cost, of watching the Empire struggle to reassemble itself from the fragments of civil war. The casualties numbered in the thousands, entire families wiped out, trade routes destroyed, villages burned in the crossfire between loyalist and rebel forces. The kind of damage that would take decades to repair, if it could be repaired at all. And at the center of all that destruction stood two people, a king who had gambled everything on principle, and a girl who had become the fulcrum upon which an empire had broken. King Valor sat on his throne. He wore full ceremonial regalia, black and gold, symbols of authority that felt hollow after everything that had happened. His face was carved from exhaustion and something deeper, the kind of weariness that came not from physical fatigue but from staring into the abyss of your own choices and seeing the bodies piled at the bottom. The wound Kadrin had given him was healing. the physical one at least. The blade had cut deep across his ribs, requiring stitches and time and the kind of care that kings rarely afforded themselves. But he had survived, as he always did, because survival was what he had been trained for since birth. The other wounds, the ones that did not bleed, were harder to catalog. The court had assembled in full. Every surviving noble house, every military commander, every voice that still mattered in the fractured landscape of imperial power. They filled the hall with their presence and their judgment and their barely concealed calculations about what came next. Duke Sareth stood at the front. He had aged visibly in the past month, new lines carved into his face, gray threading through his beard. The war had broken something in him too, some fundamental belief that empires could be preserved through rationality and compromise. "Your Majesty," he said. His voice carried across the hall with the weight of formality and barely restrained emotion. "We have gathered as you commanded. The loyal houses await your judgment on the matter at hand." The matter at hand! As if 3,000 dead soldiers in a fractured empire could be reduced to administrative language. Valor's expression did not change. He looked at the Duke, at the assembled court, at the faces that had once been united in their service to the crown and were now divided between those who had stayed loyal and those who had wavered and those who had outright rebelled. Then his eyes found Elira, and for just a moment the mask cracked, just enough for her to see the man beneath the king, the human being who had chosen her over everything and was now living with the consequences of that choice. He looked away, straightened in his throne, became the sovereign again. "Lord Cadron Valls has been tried and convicted of treason," Valor said. His voice was iron and ice. The evidence was irrefutable. The testimonies unanimous. He orchestrated rebellion, corrupted royal officers, caused the deaths of thousands through his pursuit of power disguised as principle. He paused. Let the words settle. The sentence for treason is death, by law, by tradition, by the weight of every precedent that holds this empire together. The court was silent, waiting for the inevitable, waiting for the execution that would close this chapter in blood and finality. "But I'm not executing him," Valor continued. The hall erupted. Shouts of confusion and outrage, nobles standing, voices clashing, the carefully maintained order disintegrating in seconds. Valor raised his hand. The gesture was small, almost gentle, but it carried enough authority to silence the chaos. "Lord Cadron was right about one thing," he said quietly, "that my judgment was compromised, that I prioritized one person over imperial stability, that I made decisions based on something other than cold calculation." He stood, descended the dais, walked to the center of the hall. "He was right," Valor continued, "and I would make the same choices again. Because what he called compromise, I call humanity. What he called weakness, I call the refusal to become the monster this throne demands." His voice hardened. "But I am not blind to the cost. I see the bodies. I count the dead. I know what my choices have purchased, and I will not pretend that principle comes without consequence." He turned, looked directly at Cadron where the strategist stood in chains flanked by guards. The man looked diminished, broken, but his eyes still held that calculating intelligence, still searching for angles, for leverage, for ways to survive. "You believed," Valor said to him, "that power was simply a matter of superior strategy, that human beings were game pieces, that empires were puzzles to solve, and you were willing to burn thousands to prove your point." He moved closer, close enough that only Cadron could hear the next words. "But you miscalculated, because you assumed I would break, that I would surrender her to save myself, that when forced to choose between the crown and my humanity, I would choose the crown." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "You were wrong, and that miscalculation cost you everything." He stepped back, addressed the court again. "Lord Cadron will not be executed," he announced. "He will live, in exile, stripped of title, land, and power. He will exist as a reminder that rebellion fails, that challenging the crown leads not to martyrdom, but to erasure." He gestured to the guards. "Take him to the southern borders. See that he crosses into the wasteland territories. If he returns, the sentence of death will be carried out immediately." The guards moved, began dragging Cadron toward the exit. The strategist fought against them, not physically, but with words. "You are still making the same mistake," he shouted. still believing that mercy is strength, still. Valor turned, looked at him with eyes that had gone empty. Mercy, he said, would be a quick death. This is not mercy. This is cruelty. You will live the rest of your life knowing you failed, knowing that all your brilliance and all your strategy amounted to nothing, that you bet everything on breaking a king and lost. His smile was colder than winter. That is a worse fate than execution, and you will carry it until the day you die forgotten and irrelevant. Kadrin's face went white, then red, then white again. For the first time since Alira had met him, she saw genuine fear in his eyes. The guards dragged him out, his protests fading into silence, and the throne room exploded into conversation again. Nobles arguing, officers debating, the entire apparatus of empire trying to process what had just happened. But Alira barely heard any of it, because Violor was walking toward her, through the crowd, through the noise, until he stood directly in front of her. "Walk with me," he said quietly. It was not a command, not a request, just an invitation. She nodded, followed him out of the throne room, through corridors that had become familiar over the past months, to a small garden at the eastern edge of the palace, a place she had never been before. It was quiet here, peaceful. Plants growing in careful arrangements, a fountain trickling water that caught the afternoon light, the kind of space that felt disconnected from the violence and chaos of the empire. Valor sat on a stone bench, looked at the fountain like it held answers. Alira stood nearby, waiting, not sure what to say or do or how to navigate this moment. Finally, he spoke. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what happens now, about what kind of empire we rebuild from this, about whether the cost was worth it." He looked at her. "And I do not have good answers," he admitted. "I know that thousands died, that families were destroyed, that the stability we spent decades building was shattered in weeks. All because I refused to sacrifice one person." His voice was raw, honest in a way she had never heard before. "The rational part of me, the part that was trained to be king, says that was a mistake, that I should have let you go, that preserving the empire should have been paramount." He paused. "But there is another part of me, the part that is still human beneath the crown, and that part looks at you standing here alive and whole and thinks that every death was worth it, that saving you was worth burning the world." Alira felt tears building behind her eyes, forced them back. "You cannot believe that," she said. "You cannot look at all those graves and think—" "I do believe it," he interrupted, "and that terrifies me, because it means I am exactly what Kadrin accused me of being, compromised, irrational, a king ruled by emotion rather than reason." He stood, moved closer to her. "But here's what I have realized," he said quietly, "that being human is not a weakness, that caring about individual lives is not a failure of leadership, and that if the only way to preserve an empire is to sacrifice the powerless to appease the powerful, then that empire deserves to fall." His hands were shaking. She had seen him shake exactly once before, in the armory when he had given her his mother's blade, when he had promised her agency. "So I'm making a choice," he continued. "I am choosing to rebuild this empire on different principles, not on bloodline or transformation or the kind of strength that comes from dominance, but on the idea that survival matters, that endurance is valuable, that people who refuse to break deserve protection." He looked at her with eyes that held exhaustion and determination in equal measure. "And I am asking you to help me do it." She stared at him, tried to process what he was saying. "Help you how?" she whispered. "By standing beside me," he said. "Not as a symbol, not as proof of concept, but as someone who understands what it means to survive in a world that wanted you erased. Someone who can help me build something that does not require constant sacrifice of the vulnerable to maintain order." He stepped back, created distance. "I am not asking you to be my consort or my advisor or any title the court would recognize. I am asking you to be my conscience, to be the voice that reminds me what I am fighting for when the weight of the crown tries to turn me into the machine again." The offer hung in the air between them. Alira felt the magnitude of it pressing against her chest, felt the impossible weight of choosing to stay in a world that had spent 6 years trying to convince her she did not belong. But she also felt something else, something that had been growing quietly beneath the fear and exhaustion and trauma. The understanding that she had survived, that she had endured, that she had been thrown away and discarded and marked as worthless, and had emerged from all of it stronger than anyone had expected, including herself. "Your Majesty," she said carefully, "I am not sure I am qualified to be anyone's conscience. I am just—" "You are someone who was underestimated," he interrupted. "Someone who learned to weaponize that underestimation. Someone who stood in front of an empire that wanted you silent and spoke anyway. That is exactly the qualification I need." He moved closer again, close enough that she could see the scars on his face, the gray threading through his hair, the evidence of every battle he had survived. "I am not offering you an easy life," he said. "The court will resist. The nobles will scheme. There will be challenges and threats and attempts to remove you from my side. It will be brutal and exhausting, and there will be days when you wish you had taken Kadrin's original offer and disappeared. But you will matter," he continued. "You will have agency. You will have the power to shape what comes next, and you will never again have to exist in the shadows pretending you are nothing." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "So what do you say, Illyria Voss? Will you help me build something worth surviving for?" She looked at him, at the king who had burned his empire to protect her, at the man who had chosen humanity over pragmatism even when it cost everything. And she realized that she had already made this choice, had made it the moment she had grabbed that knife in Kadrin's command tent and fought her way to his side, had made it when she had watched him spare his enemy instead of executing him, had made it when she had seen him crack open his armor and show her the human being underneath. "Yes," she said simply. The word felt like stepping off another cliff, but this time she knew she would not fall alone. Valor's expression shifted. Relief and something that might have been joy flickered across his face before the mask settled back into place. "Good," he said. "Then we begin tomorrow, tonight." He stopped, looked toward the palace where lights were beginning to illuminate windows as evening approached. "Tonight we rest," he finished, "because tomorrow starts the hard work of convincing an empire that change is possible." The coronation happened 6 months later. Not Valor's coronation. He was already king, had been king, would remain king until death or abdication. This was something different, something the empire had never seen before. The ceremony took place in the grand hall at midday, when light poured through the high windows and illuminated everything in shades of gold and white. The court assembled in full, every noble house that had survived the Civil War, every military commander, every voice that mattered, and at the center of it all stood Illyria Voss. She wore a gown that attendant Maurice had spent weeks perfecting, deep midnight blue with silver threading, elegant without being ostentatious. Her hair was arranged simply, no crown, no jewels, just herself. King Valor stood beside her. He wore his ceremonial armor but had removed the cloak, wanted this moment to be about her, not about him. The court scribe read the proclamation, his voice carrying across the hall with formal precision. "By decree of His Majesty King Valor Draven, Illyria Voss is hereby elevated to the position of royal advocate. She will serve as voice for those without voice. She will stand for those who cannot stand. She will remind this court that strength is measured not by power held but by lives protected." The words were unprecedented. The position created specifically for her. There was no template, no tradition, no framework except the one they were building in real time. Some of the nobles looked scandalized. Others looked calculating, already trying to figure out how to use this new dynamic to their advantage. A few looked almost hopeful, as if the idea that the empire could change, could value something other than bloodline and dominance, was a possibility they had not dared to imagine. Valor stepped forward, held out a simple silver chain with a pendant bearing the royal seal. "This is not a crown," he said. "It is not meant to elevate you above others. It is meant to remind you, and this court, what you represent. The principle that every person deserves to exist without apology, that survival is strength, and that we will build an empire that protects rather than destroys." He placed the chain around her neck. The pendant settled against her chest, cool metal against skin. She looked out at the assembled court, at the faces watching her, some hostile, some curious, some genuinely moved by what they were witnessing, and she spoke. Not because the ceremony required it, but because she had words that needed to be said. "I am not here," she said, "because I am special. I am here because I survived, because I refused to disappear when the world told me I should, and there are thousands like me. People this empire has discarded. People who failed transformations or were born to the wrong families or simply did not conform to expectations. Her voice was steady, clear. Those people deserve better, she continued. They deserve an empire that sees value in endurance, that understands strength comes in forms we have not traditionally recognized, and I will spend every day for the rest of my life making sure they are not forgotten. She looked at Veilor. The king has given me power, she said, but power is meaningless without purpose. My purpose is to be the reminder, the constant, uncomfortable reminder that we can do better, that we must do better, and that the cost of failing to protect the vulnerable is measured in human lives we can never recover. The hall was silent. Then Duke Sereth began to clap. Slow at first, then faster. Others joined. Not everyone, not even most, but enough that the sound filled the space with something that felt almost like approval. Illyra stood there and felt the weight of what she had just become. Not a victim, not a symbol, but an active participant in shaping the future. And it terrified her, but it also felt right. That night, after the ceremonies and the formal dinners and the endless political maneuvering, Illyra found herself back in the garden where Veilor had asked her to help rebuild the empire. She sat on the stone bench, looked at the fountain, tried to process the fact that her life had transformed so completely that she barely recognized herself anymore. Footsteps on gravel made her look up. Veilor approached. He had removed his armor, wore simple clothes, looked almost normal if you did not know what lurked beneath the surface. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the bench. She nodded. He sat beside her. For a while neither spoke, just listened to the water and the night sounds of the palace settling into darkness. Finally he said, "You know this will not be easy. The court will resist. There will be attempts to undermine you, to prove that elevating you was a mistake." "I know," she said. "And there will be days when you question whether any of this was worth it, when the cost feels too high and the progress too slow. I know that too." He looked at her. Something in his expression had softened. The king was still there, but the man was more visible now. "For what it is worth," he said, "I am grateful. That you stayed, that you fought, that you refused to be erased even when it would have been easier to disappear." She turned to face him fully. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Anything. Why me? Of all the people in this empire, of all the potential allies or advisors or companions you could have chosen, why was I worth burning everything for?" He was silent for a long time, staring at the fountain, processing the question. Then he said, "Because when I looked at you, I saw myself. The version of me that might have existed if I had not been born into power, if I had been discarded instead of elevated. And I saw that version survive with a strength I am not sure I possess." He turned to her. "You endured 6 years of systematic humiliation and emerged human," he said. "Not bitter, not vicious, not broken, just human. And that is rarer than you know. In a world that rewards cruelty and punishes weakness, you maintained something I have spent my entire life trying to protect in myself." His voice was quiet, almost vulnerable. "So yes," he said, "you were worth it. Because saving you meant saving the part of me that still believes empires can be more than machines that consume lives. And I needed that belief more than I needed stability or safety or approval." Illyra felt tears building again. This time she let them fall. "I do not know how to be what you need," she whispered. "Neither do I," he said, "but we will figure it out together." He stood, offered his hand. She took it, let him pull her to her feet. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, she felt something that resembled peace. Not happiness, not satisfaction, not resolution, just peace. The understanding that she had survived the worst the world could throw at her and had emerged as someone who mattered, someone who had agency, someone who could shape the future instead of just enduring it. "Come," Veilor said. "Tomorrow starts early, and we have an empire to rebuild." They walked back toward the palace together, side by side, king and advocate. Two people who had been forged by different fires but had somehow found their way to the same purpose. Behind them, the garden settled into darkness. The fountain continued its eternal rhythm. And the empire, fractured, bleeding, struggling to find its footing, prepared for whatever came next.